pieces of books to make them available through electronic reserves for student reading. Questions that may come up, or certainly we'll be reflecting upon with whatever happens in that case. Just what is fair use in that context? Who can use fair use? That's at stake in the Georgia State case. Who gets to make the decisions about fair use? The instructor, the library that runs the electronic reserve, university council, the provost, the president of the United States, president of the university. They are all being challenged as being responsible for these decisions, and we'll need to reflect on that. And how, indeed, will fair use meet the future needs of all of us in this context? And so, will that little tadpole become a frog? And if the tadpole becomes a frog, then maybe we'll meet some of our goals. Maybe we'll get to the point of eternal and universal access. But I would expand on that and remind ourselves that there are many other goals that we're striving for. We're really looking at the nurturing of books and the expansion of technology for some really basic purposes we don't want to lose sight of. The advancement of knowledge, access to publications, fostering innovation and creativity, supporting a worldwide exchange so that around the planet we all have access to a rich variety of materials, and reducing costs and barriers, because that's very much what copyright law is about. And what the international copyright law system is very good at is creating barriers. And in order for it to become better at reducing barriers, we'll all need to contribute, and contribute with a lot of energy and enthusiasm. There are developments in WIPO we could talk about treaties. I'll just leave that for you, and we'll have a conversation about that whenever we get a chance. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny, very much for that presentation. I think that, as you've seen, we are today going to be dealing with a very full plate. And for those of us who are scholars in the field, there's, of course, always the tension between the lack of an international fair use doctrine and the question of the three-step test. But in light of Fania's presentation this morning, one of the things that I think stands out is this question of access for what and to what end. And the real questions seem to be about perfecting control or controlling access. And we seem to be shifting between both ends of that spectrum. So to take us deeper into the Great Divide, I'm going to call on our next speaker, Dr. Till Kreutzer from the Hans-Bredow Institute, and I will invite you to the podium to speak. Thank you very much.
First of all, I have to struggle with a switch of technique between Mac and Windows. Looks good. So, hello everybody. I'm very glad to be here, and I thank the organizers, especially Neva, to invite me to Israel. I've been here before two months ago, and I liked it very much. It's a nice country, and it's nice to come back to work and to tell you something about a special issue that I've called the privatization of the balance in copyright in the digital age. This aspect is concerning not only the use of eBooks, but it's relating to the use of all kinds of copyright protected digital works. And I go quite briefly into four aspects. At first, I talk about the paradigm, former paradigm, the balance of interest in copyright law, just to tell you something about the basic. Then I turn to the reality, the privatization of the balance of interest. I tell you something about the effects of the privatization of the balance of interest, which I refer to as fundamental impediments to the user's interest. And then I tell you something about what the legislators did or did not about this issue. Let's turn to the first point, the theoretical, I call it a theoretical paradigm in copyright law, is that copyright law shall balance the interest of the creators, the industry, and the users, and therefore the general public. What's the reality nowadays? The reality is that the relation between the users and the right holders is increasingly governed by contracts and TPM, so not by statutory rules, but by private rules implemented by the rights holders usually. So how could it come to this? Can you read those slides? Hopefully, okay. It's very bright here. How could it come to this? First of all, there's a market change. Intangible files are increasingly replacing physical products. As you all know, this market change has reached different stadiums in the various branches so far, while the music, games and software industry have pushed on the structural changes towards intangible distribution very far. The changes in the publishing industry are still, well, let's say in an early stadium. However, in the reorganization of the market in the scientific area of publications to online subscriptions or download services is already an advanced stadium of development. So here we are in quite far in the development. That had a legal effect for the relationship between the customer and the vendor. Intangible copies are not sold but licensed, and this is different to physical products. They are sold and they are, well, purchased, and intangible copies are not sold but licensed, and that makes a real big legal difference because the legal regimes for license and sales agreements feature fundamental differences. For example, to impose a restrictive term of use in a license contract is much easier from the legal perspective than in a sales transaction concerning copies of copyrighted goods. For example, imagine you buy a book, and on the inside of the book cover there would be a formulation that reads, the buyer of this book is allowed to read the book only 5 times, copying is prohibited, or copying is only allowed for 1 page or 2. This would be not a valid contractual clause. That means that this rule, this formulation wouldn't have a legal binding, wouldn't be legal binding. The purchaser of the physical copy, and that's the reason for that, has no contractual relationship with the rights holder. In this case, because the purchaser buys it from a seller and the rights holder is a different party, so there are no contractual obligations between those parties, the rights holder and the user. This is quite different when it comes to the sale, the licensing of immaterial goods. There, it is no legal problem to impose binding terms of use when the book, for example, is purchased in a download store. You know that even the use of the shop is subject to a contract. When you want to use the shop, you have to agree the license or the terms of use. And that applies as well to the actual purchase. Here the user concludes a license contract with a provider anyway. So it's easy and nearly self-evident that the licensor formulates the rules for this contract, and it's no legal problem, maybe it's not a legal problem, to restrict, for example, copyright limitations and users' rights. This leads to the situation that we heard yesterday already, contract terms and conditions overrule in many cases statutorily granted privileges to use copyright-protected works. And there's a real big difference between limitations and contracts. Self-obvious, different from statutory limitations, the contractual terms serve as a rule only the interest of the suppliers and not the interest of the users. They make the rules. And there's another aspect that I have to address in this context, the impediments of technical protection measures. Additionally to the contract terms, restrictive license terms on intangible goods, in many cases, technical protection measures like copy protection measures or DRM systems or something like that are implemented to restrict the use of those. We don't talk about piracy, but we talk about legitimately acquired copies of protected works. And so here's the situation, voila, privatization of the balance of interest in copyright law. So what are the effects? At first, there are a lot of negative impacts on the interests of the users that are usually, statutorily granted in the copyright regimes, and that concern, for example, quotations. Let me give you an example. Especially quotations of audiovisual contents will be illegal in many cases when it comes to the use of intangible copies of works. The reason is, even if there would be no contractual limitation in the license terms, what is usually the case, or this kind of limitation in the contract would be invalid, technical measures often prevent to cut and paste. Let's talk about DVDs or Blu-ray discs. They are all copy protected, so it's not possible technically from the technical perspective and from the legal perspective to make a quotation, because an audiovisual quotation requires to copy parts out of the movie, out of the sound file or whatever it is, and these prohibitions and contracts on the one hand and the technical impediments on the other hand restrict this right of quotations. However, the right of quotation is elementary for the scientific and cultural progress and therefore for innovation. So this kind of a problem, I'd say. There will be negative impacts on the interest of concerning the interest in archiving, for example, through libraries, private backup copying, reselling, scientific uses, and many more aspects. The second result of this development, so the privatization through contracts and the exchange of the limitation rules to govern the relationship between the user and the vendor, is that there will be an unconceivable complication of the legal issues, especially when it comes to mass usages. Just imagine what would happen if the use of every particular book is governed by different contractual rules to mass usages, for example, by libraries, archives, etc. Let's talk about mass digitization. If there are contractual rules instead of limitations, copyright limitations, because the contracts overrule these limitations, it is very conceivable that the contract terms will be very different between each item. Even if you talk about the products of one publisher, they change their licensing terms regularly. If you have an Apple device, you all know what I mean. You get a message from Apple every 2 months or 3 months, maybe 4 months, that says the terms of the iTunes shop has been changed. You have to accept them unless you can use the shop again. And then you go, you use your iPhone and you go to the first page, and it says you can now accept or read the rest of the license terms, which are another 165 pages. So, and just imagine you want to make a mass digitization program and you have to obey all these contractual rules. That'll be impossible, I suppose. The possible effects of this development are two, I say. Either what is an unlikely effect, no uses, for example, by libraries or other public institutions are executed anymore because legal issues cannot be solved. The likely effect will rather be that individual licenses will be negotiated between the users, for example, institutions, and the rights holders, for example, publishing houses, and acquired for every use. And that leads to another situation that is very problematic because, you know, to conclude a contract is a very, well, very time-consuming and sometimes very costly matter, and this won't work as well for all those situations the people will be in, and that means again that the right holders makes the rules. So what have been the reaction of the legislator? What did they and what did they not? Fact is that this dilemma is known for many years now. What were the reactions then when everybody knew that this is going to be a problem in the digital world? What the legislators did, at first they extended the reproduction right and copyright to technically induced transient digital reproductions. The general problem with that is that copying is an integral part of any act of use of digital material, as you all know. Therefore, copy protection measures, no matter whether they are legally or technically imposed, govern any kind of use of digital goods, even the mere reception, like reading an ebook. Reading an ebook is subject to a copyright rule because you have to make copies on your computer or whatever device you need, you use, and this is subject to the reproduction right of copyright. And this leads to a massive expanded impact of the exclusive reproduction right in the digital world. What they did as well was to impose a prohibition to circumvent technical protection measures, even if the circumvention is needed to make a legitimate uses. You all know that. Maybe it's different from the US, in the US to Europe, but in Europe you have no right to circumvent, in no case, to circumvent technical protection measures to make whatever use you want to. What the legislators did as well was to indicate in the EU Info Society Directive that the European doctrine of first sale does not apply to intangible copies. So it's very easy to write in the license terms that you might not resell your ebooks, for example, because it's potentially the legal situation, the normal legal situation. What they did as well was that they imposed new limitations to allegedly support the digital use, for example, in libraries, universities, and school, that are mostly so vague that users need to license anyway. I give you another example. The German legislator introduced a new limitation for the digital document delivery services of public libraries in the year 2008. The provision, however, features so many indifferent terms and imposes such big efforts on the users in order to comply with the requirements that the biggest document delivery services like Subito, it's the biggest one in Germany, had to conclude license deals with the publishers anyway. The cost for the end users exploded then, and the reason for this development was that the legal positions for the users, in this case the libraries, was so weak that they derived from the statute, was so weak that they were not able, they had no legal position to negotiate appropriate terms. Let me turn to what the legislator did not, but should have done. They did not serve for a self-aid right to circumvent technical protection measures in case this is necessary to make use of elementary freedoms. You all know that. What they also did not was to introduce real users' rights rather than copyright limitations. You talked about, Kenny, you talked about that before. At least in Europe, I think it's the same in the US. Copyright provides not for users' rights, but only for permissions to do something.
Rights.
It's rights. It's policy or legal reality, what you're talking about?
I think both.
Okay, so it's different in Europe. Users have no rights according to copyright law. They have permissions to do something, and this is completely different because if you have a right, you can go to the rights holder, for example, and say and claim, I want to make a digital private copy, so this thing is copy protected. Give me the stuff I need to do to make use of my privilege. This would be possible if you had a right, but if you only have a permission, it's much easier to rule it out in a contract, for example, and to say, well, you might not do any private copies anymore. What they did not as well was to serve for contract proof limitations and exceptions. We talked about that yesterday already. From my point of view, to effectively protect the user's interest, as they are always the weaker party in contractual relationships with the rights holders, provisions would be required that state explicitly that contract clauses, especially in standard terms and conditions, which restrict or rule out copyright limitations are null and void. We have to discuss this, how to implement this, but I think that'll be possible at least on the European level. The question remains, is it a bug or a feature of today's copyright regulation that legislators fail to provide for effective limitations? And if it's part of strategy, what is the idea behind? Let me pose a question about that. Will the market alone adjust imbalances between the interest in copyright law without regulative intervention of the legislators? At least so far it never did. Thanks a lot.
I'm sure we're going to have a very robust question and answer session, I can tell already. So what we've heard, of course, are some pretty important, I think, movements from the legal perspective that has some interesting implications. I think from the European perspective, where copyright comes from a natural law philosophy, more of a personal rights tradition, it in some ways makes some sense to see stronger rights being imposed. It perhaps makes far less sense for common law countries where the government has always been the responsible party for balancing the regulatory system. And so what we see, I think, from Till's presentation is a convergence of the natural law and copyright positions, which commentators have noticed over the years, but certainly in the digital arena, we are seeing that convergence very strongly. And that, of course, raises, I think, issues about whether the copyright system is truly just a system of private contracts rather than a system of public allocation of creative goods. So to wrap up our panel, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Guy Pesach, who is from the Hebrew University Faculty of Law, and he will give us our last presentation before questions and answers.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. This conference is about books and e-books, and I think as part of it, it also concentrates on issues related to preservation, long-term intergenerational access provision to books and e-books. My talk will focus mostly on preservation and social remembering. I will leave aside contemporary issues of production and distribution of digital books. But before beginning, I just want to mention that although this conference is about books, I think just like Till just mentioned, eventually at the end of the day, similar questions arise in the context of all other types of cultural products, movies, music, online video games, photographs that were mentioned by Kenny and so on. So I think one question just to raise up to the forum is whether there is a bias in our focus on e-books. Indeed, just like Fania said, books are unique, but by focusing on books only, maybe we neglect a broader picture that has to be addressed. Now, just the page down, okay. Now, as long as time will permit me, I will speak about the uniqueness of digitalized cultural preservation. How is it different than tangible preservation? The impact of copyright law, much has been said. I will not repeat things that were already mentioned, but only go briefly on the points that I think are important to mention. Privatization, I did not know that Till will speak about privatization, but yet again, privatization also appears in the context of digitized cultural preservation. This is a trend that goes along with digitization. I think two sides of the same coin eventually. And looking ahead, what can be done, what should be done, what won't be done probably in the next 10 years. So let's begin. Page down. Digital cultural preservation. How is digitized preservation different than tangible preservation? What's the difference between preserving and providing access to Gutenberg's first edition of the Bible than digitizing this first edition and then making it accessible through Google's libraries project? So I think several elements may make digital preservation distinct and unique vis-a-vis tangible preservation. The first element is that we're shifting from control to distribution. Tangible preservation was conducted mainly by control over unique, authentic, tangible objects. We wanted to preserve those objects and also to manage access in order to make sure that the object will not be destructed. Digital preservation operates in a reverse mode. It operates through redundancy and distribution. Multiple copies are being distributed through different locations. This is the whole concept of preserving and making those copies accessible. Once the object is being digitized, preservation and access, and from my point of view, access is a main focal of preservation, is best served by multiple copies other than by control over a unique, authentic object. So this is one main difference. The second, I think, difference is that we're shifting toward a model which is much more decentralized and much more diversified. In prior decades, there were very few unilateral, mostly public institutions that were dealing with preservation. Museums, libraries, public libraries, mostly cultural institutions that were focused on high culture and that had a certain very, I think, narrowly structured agenda on what to preserve, how to preserve, and how to provide access. Digital preservation works in a totally different manner. YouTube, file sharing softwares, social networks, Facebook, all those institutions, and they are social institutions, are mechanisms for preservation and access provision. The whole set of considerations to decide what to preserve, how to contextualize the set of items that we decide to preserve, how to retrieve material for access, is now being conducted by a diversified range of institutions that are public, commercial, civic-oriented. Somebody mentioned the Creative Commons. So it's a system that, at least potentially, is much more promising in terms of cultural democracy. So this is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that digitized preservation also includes a strong element of convergence. Going back to prior decades, we had a separation between cultural institutions that dealt with cultural production and cultural distribution, book publishers, record companies, movies, studios, and distinct, separate institutions that were in charge over preservation. The National Library of the Israeli one, maybe university libraries. There was a separation. One structure of institutions dealt with production, the other structure of institutions dealt with preservation. In digital domains, we see a strong element of convergence. One strong element of convergence refers to the fact that there is a convergence between contemporary cultural production and the whole element of preservation. Amazon's Kindle, iTunes, YouTube are all institutions that do both things. They both provide contemporary access of content to consumers, but as a side effect, as an integral element of the fact that they are based on digital database, they are also institutions of preservation. 50 years from now, 100 years from now, those places would be the places that people, historians, politicians will go to in order to learn what happened 100 years ago. So, at least as a title, we can see some shift or an extension of corporate media, traditional corporate media, toward what I call corporate memory institutions. Now, just to emphasize, I don't think that public preservation institutions will vanish. They'll stay there, and it's very important that they'll stay there. But at the same time, at least some segments of the preservation field will be governed by corporate memory institutions. The impact of copyright law. So much has been said, most has been said. One point that needs to be, I think, emphasized once again is that in tangible domains, copyright law was outside of the picture. Tangible objects, the original version of Gutenberg's printed version of the Bible is not governed by copyright law. The digital copy is governed by copyright law. So digitization imposes a new encounter between copyright law and the whole field of preservation. This is something that did not exist in tangible domains. So, and just like Till said, and I presume that many people mentioned yesterday, licensing regimes become the godfather of digitized cultural preservation. So if a minute ago I mentioned the shift from control, tangible control, to distribution, copyright law throws us back into a paradigm of control. But this time control is not a byproduct of tangible scarcity, rather it is I would say an artificial product of legal regulation. Copyright brings along enclosure, commercialization, and eventually privatization. Once being governed by copyright law, digital cultural preservation is bound to be at least partially privatized. Now, Kenny spoke about exemptions. I won't focus on expansions, and I'll only mention that the current paradigm of exemption is unable to regulate digitized cultural preservation in a way that would endorse a public regarding conception of digitized cultural preservation. And I think that there are several reasons. One main reason that was already mentioned is international copyright law. There are some barriers and thresholds that international copyright law imposes that prohibit or disable a robust scene of digitized cultural preservation. The second thing, I think, goes back to copyright law's tradition. Copyright law, at least historically, was a separate legal branch than laws that deal with cultural preservation. Traditionally, cultural preservation was governed by cultural property law. This is a distinct branch of law. Copyright law has no tradition of dealing with cultural preservation issues. Its main perspective was inducing the creation and distribution of cultural products, not regulating intergenerational social remembering of cultural items. And I think the third barrier goes back to the element of convergence. When we speak about convergence between contemporary cultural production and digitized cultural preservation, we are speaking about the fact that on a daily basis, cultural preservation activities may function as a market substitute to contemporary distribution of cultural items. And this imposes a tension mostly on the fourth factor of the fair use defense, that copyright law has difficulties to come up with successful solutions. Now, if partial elements of the digital preservation fields are being privatized, what are the disadvantages? I would like to begin by mentioning or emphasizing that, at least from my perspective, the entry of commercial fields into social remembering is a positive development. It is a positive development because those of us who support popular culture, those of us who support commercial culture, want to see preservation being conducted not only through top-down state mechanisms, but also by a wide range of commercial entities. Yet, at the same time, privatization has its discontents. Just mentioning one point, and I'll skip the other point, is that privatization imposes certain pressures on traditional public regarding cultural institutions. Those pressures are being conducted in two directions. One direction goes back to the issue of licensing, and that's the direction of coercion. When the National Library has to obtain licenses in order to undergo digitization processes, it has to comply with the terms of and conditions of commercial entities. So, at least as a practical matter, it becomes an extension, an alter ego of those conditions which are imposed by commercial entities, and then they are going down the stream to the users of the public institution. The second point is what I call evolution, or transforming the cultural DNA of traditional memory institutions. I think that Kenny wrote a paper that surveys the way museums decide upon their access policy, and we see that, at least in some cases, some museums are fascinated by the commercial potential of digital artifacts. So their cultural DNA is being transformed by the prospects of making money out of digital artifacts. no time to speak about discontent. Generally speaking, the same disadvantages that we see in privatizing contemporary speech and discourse arenas apply when we speak about intergenerational social remembering. The same requirements to have an equal and robust arena for exchanging views and content apply also in the intergenerational dimension, and yet once we privatize social remembering, we democratize the way social remembering is being conducted. And just one element which is worth emphasizing is the fact that traditionally there was a separation, again, the separation between those who dealt with preservation, those who dealt with social remembering, and those who produced and distributed contemporary information and contemporary media products. If we converge those two elements, we provide corporate media the ability to set not only the political agenda of nowadays, but also what would be remained for future generations. And this, I think, destabilizes some checks and balances that existed in the past. Looking ahead, what can be done, what should be done, what won't be done. First thing is copyright reforms. Going back to the issue of exemptions and limitations, I would only mention that in my view there is an essential need for a new exemption that will deal with digitized cultural preservation. Such an exemption should apply not only to public regarding institutions, but also to individuals, private users, social networks, and any other type of activity that wants to put its imprint on the landscape of history. Fair use should be adjusted in a way that provides much more breathing space for private copying, because private copying is a way of putting your imprint on future generations. The transformative test, those who know the Campbell decision, is also a major barrier against digitized cultural preservation, because we want to preserve not only by transforming, but also by making an authentic, high quality, full image, not the thumbnail of the Grime decision,